They thought they had seen it all while following Jesus these past 3 years. Cured lepers, once blind men who could now see, water turned to wine, thousands fed from just a few morsels, demons cast out, storms calmed, walking on water, and Lazarus raised from the dead. And the teachings: love God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself, serve others, righteousness instead of right appearances. Even though they could not conceive of it now, they stood on the threshold of their final week under the rabbi's human tutelage. It all started innocently enough. It was the first day of the week. They had finally reached Bethany with Jesus on Friday evening, just before the Sabbath. They had been traveling from Capernaum to Jerusalem these past 3 days, so they could celebrate the Passover in the Jews' most holy city, as was their custom. That Sunday afternoon, Jesus called John and James, and on his precise instructions, they went up the hill to Bethphage. Exactly as Jesus had told them, they found a donkey tethered in a doorway, with a colt that had not yet been ridden. And exactly as Jesus had instructed them, the password, "The Master has need of them," allowed James and John to return with the animals in hand. Jesus surprised them all by mounting the young colt instead of the donkey. They saw the significance at once. Jesus was about to enter Jerusalem, not as a pilgrim on foot, as tradition dictated. He was riding into the city as a king. And when the king came on a donkey, not on horseback, he came in peace. When word spread that Jesus would enter the city, hundreds of citizens and pilgrims shouted their welcome as this renowned healer and teacher began his ride down the slope of the Mount of Olives. They pulled off cloaks, laying them in the road. Soon others began to cut branches, especially palms, from the trees shading the lane, and threw them ahead of the colt to form a carpet of greenery, or they waved them as they walked. The palm branch was a symbol of victory. Judeans and Galileans and pilgrims all struggled for a place in the procession as it neared the city gate, with Jesus riding at the center of an adoring, vocal, palm-waving mob. Then, after his deliberately royal entry, Jesus perplexed the 12. He had not exploited the mood of the hour. He had not tried to seize political power or fan religious fervor. He sent the donkeys back to their owner and allowed the mob to fade away. Then, before darkness, he had gone quietly home to Bethany. On Monday morning, the disciples again approached Jerusalem with Jesus, who was this time on foot, without a crowd. They neared the beautiful gate of the temple. Once through the gate, they were confronted by the roar of an oriental market. Jesus now stood surveying the scene, a desecration which Caiaphas in his greed had established 3 years earlier. Jesus watched and listened for a few moments. Suddenly, with set jaw, he walked up to the nearest row of money changers' tables and pushed them over, one after another. Coins clattered on the stones. Doves, now loosed from their cages, flew confused circles around the room while flocks of lambs ran frightened toward the gate. Panic swept through the crowd. The court was emptying rapidly, leaving overturned tables and upset chairs to litter the floor. Soon, however, the money changers were replaced by the blind and the lame. And then came the boys and girls. They poured into the temple while Jesus healed and taught. Songs and shouts of joy were echoing throughout the halls and courts of the temple, acclaiming Jesus as King of the Jews. The temple officials and religious leaders were appalled. Jesus, however, patiently healed the remaining lame and thanked the children. Then he turned his back on his opponents and returned to Bethany for the night. "24 hours later, on Tuesday morning, the 12 again followed Jesus down from the Mount of Olives, walking through the Garden of Gethsemane until they entered the temple once more. They found that the flocks, herds, and money changers had not returned. Many people noticed his arrival and gathered around. Again, the rulers attempted to trap Jesus in his theology, and again, they were left frustrated. While they retired to plot his downfall, the people settled down to listen as Jesus sat teaching for hours. Again, late that afternoon, he and his followers retired beyond the Mount of Olives to Bethany, where they spent a quiet evening, one of the last they would enjoy together. Wednesday was much the same. A morning walk to the temple, hours of teaching interspersed with verbal sparring between Jesus and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Huge, excitable crowds filled the city and the temple. That evening, as they climbed the path up the Mount of Olives to his favorite place of prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus remained solemn. While the 12 sat silently absorbed in all they had seen and heard that day, Jesus said quietly, "As you know, the Passover is 2 days away, and the Son of Man will be handed over to be crucified." He led his men back through the shadows to Bethany. They walked in silence under the Passover moon, 2 days off the full. A cold fear mixed with disbelief clutched at their hearts. It was the last night they would spend in the village of Bethany, for the Passover night must be spent within the city walls. None of them slept well. Thursday morning. The disciples now feared for Jesus' safety. Peter even secured 2 short swords, which were hidden beneath his cloak. They were all relieved on Thursday morning, when Jesus did not lead them back to Jerusalem, but rose early and went to spend the morning alone in the garden on the Mount of Olives. Judas Iscariot, as treasurer and administrator for the 12, left them soon afterward to buy their Passover lamb. Time passed, and the group wondered vaguely why Judas took so long, but suspected nothing. Unknown to them, Judas made a detour on his way to the sheep market, to the high priest's palace. Thursday afternoon. Early in the afternoon, they all approached Jesus to ask where they should prepare the Passover feast. Judas stood close, listening intently. But Jesus did not answer the question directly. He gave detailed instructions to John and Peter, which, as they realized afterward, could provide no clue to Judas. Jesus did not want any interruption at his Last Supper with the 12. As they entered the city, they saw, exactly as Jesus had told them, a man marked out from the crowd by an earthenware water jar on his shoulder. Women carried these, men carried wineskins. The water carrier stopped at a substantial house. They were greeted by the father of young John Mark, the future companion of Barnabas and Paul. He escorted them upstairs to a large room, quiet and already furnished with cushions and a low table. Thursday evening. Toward evening, shortly before Passover began at 6 p.m., John and Peter heard Jesus and his 10 other disciples ascending the stairs to the upper room. As they took their place for the feast, Jesus stood up and began the supper by the time-honored ceremony of giving thanks. As the meal proceeded, Jesus followed the ancient Passover liturgy, yet changed it by actions and words which sank deep into their consciousness, though none of them yet understood. Jesus rose, took bread, and gave thanks. Then he broke it and passed the pieces to them. "Take and eat. This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." When he lifted the cups and spoke the words of thanks, he handed it to them. "Drink it, all of you. This is my blood of the new covenant, which is poured out for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins." Then, to their horror, their master suddenly declared with great emphasis, "One of you is going to betray me." Looking at each other, the 12 searched their hearts, seeking whether they could ever betray him. "Lord, is it I?" asked John, as the same anxious question arose from almost all. Jesus stretched to dip a piece of food into a bowl. He offered it to Judas, a gesture of honor which opened a last route of repentance. Judas hesitated. The moment passed. Judas took the morsel. "What you are going to do Do quickly." Judas rose and walked from the room. He descended the stairs and went out into the night. Thursday night. By now, it was late at night. Led by Jesus, they sang the final psalm of the Passover liturgy before going downstairs. John caught a glimpse of a young John Mark, awakened by their song, peeping from behind a curtain. Jesus and his disciples walked quietly through the city in the light of the nearly full moon. They walked on a little, then Jesus stopped. "You will all fall away, but after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee." At that, a now emotional Peter replied, "I will never deny you. If everyone else does, I will not." "Truly, truly, Peter, this night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter insisted vehemently. John echoed his words, and so did they all. Early Friday morning. No one spoke as the disciples followed Jesus to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he had often taken them. When he reached the stone shelter housing the oil press which gave the garden its name, he told them to sit down while I go over there and pray. He beckoned Peter, James, and John to come with him. The hour was late, and they were exhausted. "My soul is crushed with sorrow, almost to the point of death. Stop here and keep awake." Jesus went a stone's throw further and fell to the ground. Peter took refuge in sleep, then James and John. There was a secret eyewitness and eavesdropper who stayed awake, however, John Mark. He had thrown on the first garment at hand about his body when the disciples left his home, and had crept after the company undetected. Mark saw Jesus kneel down and pray as though in agony. Though midnight had passed and the night was cold, the body of Jesus poured with sweat. So great was the pressure on his heart that the sweat which fell to the ground was bloody. Mark, his own heart pounding, heard the words, "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away, except that I drink it, may your will be done." Then Jesus rose from the ground. With a clank of arms, an approaching force drew nearer. The 12 saw soldiers and temple police carrying flaming torches on poles, despite the nearly full moon, to hunt down their quarry if he fled through the trees, and lamps in earthenware holders in case he hid in caves. Judas detached himself from the soldiers. He paced up to Jesus and shouted, "Greetings, Rabbi!" and gave him a disciple's customary mark of respect by kissing Jesus. "Are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?" asked Jesus. Judas did not answer. The next sight which John Mark witnessed at first took him by surprise, although he would later agree that it should not have. He saw Peter draw his sword and strike out wildly, slicing off the right ear of Malchus, a body servant of the high priest. Jesus stepped up to the shocked, bleeding Malchus, who desperately held his ear to his head, and healed him. Now John Mark watched an even more unbelievable sight as every one of the 12 ran for their lives, except Judas. Peter fled, James fled, Andrew fled, as did John. Someone suddenly saw young Mark. Hands grasped at his linen garment. Mark shook himself free and fled naked into the night. John, however, recovered his nerve quickly. He turned back in time to see the soldiers seize Jesus and bind his arms tightly, then march him out of the garden. With newfound courage, John followed the procession and soon noticed Peter, who now also joined the group. As they jostled into the courtyard of the high priest's palace, both John and Peter managed to join the tail of the escort before the gates clanged shut. They saw Jesus, his arms stiff from the cord, being roughly escorted toward the wing occupied by Annas, the old man who had been high priest until deposed by the Romans 15 years before. Peter crept near a charcoal fire and tried to warm himself undetected. John quietly joined the priests and scribes watching the interrogation. Annas was asking Jesus questions. "I have done nothing in secret," Jesus would say, for which a guard slapped him on the face, and the welt showed up raw. At that, Annas ended his questions and ordered the guards to march Jesus to his son-in-law and current high priest Caiaphas, who was waiting with a quorum of Sanhedrin members. The guards led him across the wide courtyard and up those steps into the main building. Peter and those around the fire could see Jesus closely. Before dawn, Friday morning. Throughout the proceedings, Jesus had kept silent. Finally, Caiaphas stood up. "Are you not going to answer?" All eyes turned on Jesus. He stayed silent. Caiaphas finally asked the question they had all longed to hear. "I charge you under oath by the living God. Are you Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" "I am." At that, the high priest tore his robe to express formal abhorrence of such blasphemy. They condemned him as worthy of death. Sanhedrin members Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea dissented, but were powerless. The high priest gave a curt order. The guards blindfolded Jesus, then spat at his face and pummeled him with fists. Priests, scribes, and retainers ran forward to spit or strike, shouting, "Prophesy! Tell us who hit you!" and thereby absolved themselves of being accessories to blasphemy. Flinching at the blows, John recognized that they were also submitting Jesus to a traditional test. According to the scribes' interpretation of the 11th chapter of Isaiah, the true Messiah would be able to see blindfolded. John's mind clutched at this opportunity which Jesus was given to save himself, but Jesus declined to take it. He stayed silent. Yet, at the moment when the council was convincing itself that Jesus was not a true prophet, his prophecy to Peter was fulfilled. One of the maids of the high priest approached Peter, who was warming himself by the fire. "You were with Jesus, the Nazarene." Peter denied it. "I don't know what you're talking about." He walked over to the gate at the edge of the courtyard. Later, others standing at the fire began saying, "There he is! There's that disciple of Jesus! I told you, I don't even know the man." Finally, one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of Malchus, asked, "Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus?" "How could I be out there with a man I have never met?" Peter swore curses upon himself, while across the courtyard came the shouts and the sounds of blows as they hit the blindfolded Jesus. Peter glanced up. In the torchlight, he saw guards remove the blindfold. As the cockcrow died away, Jesus turned and looked straight at Peter. The disciple stumbled through the open gate, out into the street, weeping bitterly. Dawn, Friday. The Sanhedrin paused briefly until the first light on Friday before condemning Jesus formally, because a judgment pronounced in the hours of darkness was invalid. They then had him march the short distance to the Roman governor's palace, where Pontius Pilate had risen at his usual hour before dawn. Upon learning of their arrival, Pilate came out to meet the Sanhedrin representatives and their prisoner. "What charges do you bring against this man?" They did not give a direct answer. Blasphemy was no offense in Roman law unless a man blasphemed the divine emperor, a crime silently committed by every devout Jew. They hoped Pilate would dispatch Jesus quickly, without trial, as a disturber of the peace. The prisoner did not appear to be the usual run-of-the-mill troublemaker, so Pilate demanded details. Still, they hedged. Upon discovering that Jesus was a Galilean subject, and since he could find no case against the man, Pilate told the prosecution to lay the case before Herod. He then went on with the next cases. The first two ended swiftly. 2 thieves were proved guilty of sedition. Each robber was sentenced to the cross. No appeal lay open. Only Roman citizens might appeal to Caesar. Of course, Roman citizens could not be executed by crucifixion. It was regarded as so cruel, slow, and disgusting that it could be used only for slaves and low provincials. Before long, Pilate was distressed to learn that Jesus was back. Herod had tired of the case quickly. Jesus had not only refused to perform a miracle for Herod, but he would not even respond to his questions. Pilate then approached the Sanhedrin with Jesus in tow. But now they had been joined by a throng of Jewish sympathizers, curiosity seekers, and pilgrims. "What shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" "Crucify him! Let him be crucified!" roared the crowd. But Pilate was not prepared to condemn an innocent man. As a first step, he ordered Jesus scourged, to be beaten, not with rods, but with the dreaded flagellum, which was the preliminary to crucifixion. When the crowd saw what was left of him, Pilate reasoned, their sympathy should ensure acquittal. Syrian soldiers briskly marched Jesus to a courtyard, where a half-pillar, waist-high, stood between runnels for washing away the blood. The pillar had been used twice that day for the two thieves. Soldiers stripped Jesus naked and bent him over the pillar. Two burly slaves stood ready. Each picked up a whip of 3 leather thongs on which had been strung lumps of bone, and standing on either side of him, they brought the whips down in turn with all their might, to cut through skin, nerves, and muscle. They lashed his shoulders and spinal cord, his buttocks and his thighs. Thongs curled around and cut his chest and ribs. The pain was atrocious. Jesus did not cry out. With superhuman strength, he endured the pain in silence. When the flogging stopped and they unbound him, he stood in his blood, shivering from shock, cut and bruised from shoulders to calves, and they mocked him. They fashioned a garland of thorns with spikes which aped a ray-like crown of royalty. They put a rod in his right hand and then knelt before him and crowed, "Hail, King of the Jews!" All of their hatred of Jews erupted as they seized the rod and hit him on the head, driving the thorns deeper into his skin. One by one, the soldiers came up to kneel, to rise and spit on his face, to slap him, infuriated by his silence. A passage in Isaiah even indicates that they pulled out his beard. The horseplay stopped when the command came to return Jesus to Pilate. But Pilate had miscalculated his hope of sympathy for the victim. Jesus followed him out of the shadows, slowly and painfully wearing a purple robe and the crown of thorns, his face defiled by spittle and marked by agony, the robe soaked in blood. "Crucify!" a voice from the crowd called out in a tone of venom. Then the cry was taken up, "Crucify! Crucify!" If Pilate did his duty and released Jesus, whom he had found innocent, the peace of Jerusalem would crumble before his eyes, and his career might be ruined. He ordered a bowl of water to be brought. The crowd quieted as they watched him solemnly wash his hands. "I am not responsible for the death of this innocent man. It is your doing." Then, as guilty of judicial murder as the Jewish leaders, he sentenced Jesus to the cross. Later, Friday morning. On this Friday, in early April, the sun was already strong when the slaves carrying ladders, ropes, iron nails, and hammers exited the palace with Jesus. He wore his own clothes, but no one had removed the crown of thorns. Across his shoulders lay a heavy beam, which weighted down his body, weak from the loss of blood and lack of sleep and food. After a few yards along the street, he staggered and fell, the log pinning him to the ground. Then a soldier caught sight of a strong-looking fellow walking up the street, an African named Simon from Cyrene, who was coming into the city from the country. The centurion exercised his right to order any citizen to carry a load 1 mile, and commanded him to take the crossbeam. Since later Simon's 2 sons, Alexander and Rufus, became members of the first-century church, the experience must have changed his life. The procession passed through the city gates and stopped on a rocky outcrop with contours which fitted its name, Place of the Skull, Golgotha in Aramaic, Calvarius in Latin. The executioners laid their hands on Jesus and stripped him naked, even tearing away the loincloth portrayed in Christian art. The Romans did not vary their practice because circumcised Jews abhorred nudity. Shame and affront to human dignity were a part of the punishment. They threw Jesus on the ground. 2 soldiers stretched out his arms. A third pushed the crossbeam under them, while a fourth pressed hard against his knees. A soldier picked up a long nail and hammer, knelt on one of Jesus' arms, and poised the nail above the palm. With a sharp blow on the nail, he drove it through Jesus' hand into the crossbeam. Each blow increased the pain. A second soldier started on the palm of the other hand. The 2 thieves who were undergoing the same torture were screaming obscenities, but Jesus did not scream. He prayed. In gulps and gasps, the words came clear between the hammer blows. "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." Their job done, the executioners wiped the blood from their hands. One of them climbed the ladder. The other lifted the beam with Jesus nailed to it, and thus caused the most dreadful pain as jolt by jolt they hoisted him by ropes and secured the beam with cords to the upright so that his body's weight pressed down on a stout peg projecting between the crotch. They crossed his legs, forced his feet against the tree, and drove a nail through each. The soldier removed the ladder and rope and left Jesus to hang by the nails, his feet a little way off the ground. 3 hours later, the pain had worked its havoc on Jesus' body until he was an even more horrifying sight. He was contorted, disfigured, despicable. Blood dripped from his hands and feet. Lips and face and limbs were blotched by sun blisters and insect bites. The stripes where the scourge had curled round his chest and stomach and legs showed vivid against his skin. His bones stuck out from the flesh. Friday afternoon. By 3 in the afternoon, the land had been covered by darkness for 3 hours. An invisible weight bore down upon Jesus' shoulders. His grief was fearful to behold. His breath came in short gasps, as if he were dying already, though a man crucified in the prime of life might take 3 days to die. Suddenly, Jesus gave a final cry, its tone not of desperation, but of triumph. "It is finished! Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Gently, Jesus bowed his head with its crown of thorns. A second later, his body hung utterly still. The ground shook in an earth tremor, strong enough to split rocks in the nearby quarries, while in the temple, half a mile off, the great curtain which blocked the way into the Holy of Holies tore in half from the top to the bottom. As the earthquake ceased, the darkness lifted. Executioners stood white and awestruck. The Roman centurion looked up at the corpse of Jesus and said, "Surely that man is the Son of God." The body of Jesus hung stiff in the afternoon light for another 2.5 hours. Exposure, alive or dead, was part of the sentence of crucifixion. About an hour before sunset, a picket of soldiers carrying spears and iron mallets approached. They converged on Jesus. He looked dead. To make death certain, a soldier jabbed him in the side with a spear. There was a sudden gush of blood and water. As the evening shadows lengthened, the gruesome work began, extracting the nails with iron pincers, lowering the rigid arms, and laying the corpse on the ground. Hardly had the soldiers completed their work when Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus approached with their servants. In their hurry to complete the burial before the Sabbath, they wrapped the body of Jesus unwashed, but with reverence. They carried him the short distance to Joseph's tomb, since Jesus had no family grave in Jerusalem, nor was there time to look further. And there they lay him, in this rich man's tomb. The burly servants, straining, heaved into position the great boulder which blocked the entrance. John, Mary, and a handful of women wept at the tomb, and would spend the night of the Sabbath in mute despair. Their world had collapsed. Bereft of Jesus, they had lost hope and purpose, alone in a dark world that was as bleak as his tomb. Long forgotten were Jesus' words of promise to see them again. They searched for strength from within themselves, but found only fear. Jesus had been their comforter, and now he was gone. As they watched the rock bleakly roll into place, how could they know that he would be so again?